The encounter in the snow. The wind howled like a living creature, rattling the walls of John's remote research shelter. Snow fell relentlessly outside, piling up against the windows and burying the world in an endless blanket of white. John tightened his jacket and sighed, sipping lukewarm coffee as he stared at the blinking lights of his console. The weather was worse than usual, and he'd already spent the past 2 days locked inside with nothing but the hum of machines to keep him company. Suddenly, a sound broke through the storm, a faint, uneven noise that didn't belong. John froze, his heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the usual creak of the shelter or the howl of the wind. It sounded human, or close enough to it. Placing his mud down, he grabbed his flashlight and headed for the door. His instincts screamed at him to stay inside, but curiosity and a sense of duty pushed him forward. As a scientist stationed on this desolate ice planet, it was his job to monitor and report anything unusual. Besides, if someone was out there, they wouldn't survive long in the brutal cold. The moment John opened the door, the icy wind hit him like a slap to the face. He squinted against the storm, his flashlight cutting through the swirling snow. The sound came again, closer this time, a weak, almost pleading cry. "Hello," he called out, his voice muffled by the wind. "Is someone there?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then his beam of light caught movement, a shadow, small and hunched, staggering through the snow. John's stomach tightened as he approached, his boots crunching in the icy terrain. When he got closer, he saw her, a figure collapsed in the snow, barely moving. She wasn't human. Her skin glowed faintly in patterns that shimmered like moonlight on water, and her thin frame was wrapped in tattered fabric that offered no protection from the cold. Her long, silver hair was tangled with frost, and her delicate hands clutched at the snow as if trying to pull herself forward. John dropped to his knees beside her. "Hey, can you hear me?" he asked, shaking her shoulder gently. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises that glowed faintly, like tiny stars. She muttered something in a language he didn't understand, her voice weak and trembling. "You're freezing," John said, shrugging off his heavy jacket. He wrapped it around her, the oversized material swallowing her small frame. The cold bit into his skin instantly, but he ignored it. "Come on, let's get you inside." She didn't resist as he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost fragile, and she shivered uncontrollably as he carried her back to the shelter. Each step was a struggle against the wind, but John pushed on, his determination fueled by the urgency of her condition. When they reached the shelter, John kicked the door shut behind them and laid her gently on a cot. He turned up the heat and grabbed a blanket, tucking it around her as she continued to shiver. Her glowing patterns flickered like a dimming light bulb, and her breathing was shallow. "Stay with me," John said, his voice steady despite the knot of worry in his chest. "You're safe now." She opened her eyes again, her gaze locking onto his. This time, her expression softened slightly, as if realizing he meant no harm. She spoke again, her words still incomprehensible, but the tone was one of gratitude or desperation. It was hard to tell. "Don't talk," John said, crouching beside her. "You need to rest." She closed her eyes, and for a moment, John feared she had slipped into unconsciousness. But then he noticed her breathing slow and steady, the faint glow of her patterns stabilizing. Whatever species she was, she seemed to respond to warmth and shelter. John leaned back, his mind racing. Who was she? Where had she come from? This planet was supposed to be uninhabited except for the research teams, and no one had mentioned anything about sentient life forms. And yet here she was, an alien woman on the verge of death, now lying in his shelter. As he watched over her, John's console beeped, drawing his attention. He walked over and checked the readings. Strange energy signatures had appeared in the area, their intensity growing stronger by the minute. His heart sank. Whatever, or whoever, had left her out there might still be nearby. Glancing back at the cot, John saw the woman stirring slightly, her glowing patterns flickering once more. He realized she wasn't just a survivor. She was a warning. Something dangerous was coming, and he might be the only thing standing between her and whatever was hunting her. The storm outside raged on, but inside the shelter, the tension was just beginning to build. The alien awakens. The faint hum of the station's heater filled the air, but John's attention was fixed on the cot in the corner. The alien woman lay still, her glowing patterns now faintly pulsating in a rhythm that reminded him of breathing. Her earlier distress had faded, replaced by a fragile calm. John sat at his desk, running his fingers through his unkempt hair. The questions swirling in his mind were endless. Who was she? How had she survived the icy storm outside? And what had driven her to this desolate planet? A sudden gasp broke the silence. John turned sharply, his chair scraping against the floor. The alien woman was awake. She sat up abruptly, her eyes darting around the room as if trying to take in everything at once. Her glowing patterns flared brightly for a moment, casting soft light on the walls, then dimmed again as her body seemed to register its exhaustion. "Hey, it's okay," John said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "You're safe here." Her gaze snapped to him, sharp and wary. She clutched the thermal jacket tightly around her, the fabric far too large for her small frame. For a moment, they stared at each other, the silence thick with tension. Then she spoke. The words were soft, melodic, and entirely alien. John didn't understand a single one, but her tone carried a mixture of confusion and fear. He shook his head and pointed to himself. "John," he said slowly, tapping his chest. "John." She hesitated, then pointed to herself. Her lips moved, forming a name that sounded like Lyra. Her voice was faint, as if every syllable cost her strength. "Lyra," John repeated, nodding. She seemed to relax slightly at his attempt, though her eyes remained cautious. Before he could say more, the lights in the station flickered. Both of them froze. John's gaze darted to the console on his desk, where an alert blinked in angry red. A faint, rhythmic beeping filled the room. His sensors were picking up movement outside. John's stomach tightened. Movement. Out here. The storm should have made travel impossible, even for him, and certainly for anyone or anything not wearing protective gear. Lyra tensed visibly, her glowing patterns flaring again. She pointed to the window, speaking urgently in her language. Her voice was strained, her words rapid, but John didn't need a translator to understand her meaning. "Danger." "I don't know what you're saying," John muttered, stepping toward the console. He brought up the external cameras, but the swirling snow made it impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. Still, the sensors didn't lie. Something, or someone, was out there. Lyra stood unsteadily, leaning against the cot for support. Her glowing patterns pulsed in time with the faint hum of the heater, but her expression was resolute. She pointed to a small damaged device on the table. It was the same one she had been carrying when John found her. "You need this?" John asked, picking it up. It felt cold and smooth in his hand, its surface etched with symbols that glowed faintly blue. He held it out to her. She took it carefully, her fingers trembling as she pressed a sequence of buttons on its surface. The device emitted a soft hum, then projected a flickering hologram into the air. The image was hard to make out at first. A map, perhaps? No, it was more like a scanner. It showed the shelter in the center and several bright dots moving steadily toward them. John's throat went dry. Those aren't friendly, are they?" Lyra's silence was answer enough. She glanced at him, her glowing patterns dimming as if to reflect her exhaustion. Then she pointed at him, then at the door, shaking her head firmly. She didn't want him to go outside. "I wasn't planning on it," John muttered, though his heart raced at the implication. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, they were getting closer. And they weren't stopping. The console beeped again, louder this time. The dots on the hologram had nearly reached the shelter. John glanced at Lyra, who was gripping the device tightly, her glowing patterns now flickering in what looked like agitation or fear. "All right," John said, forcing himself to stay calm. "We'll deal with this. You just need to." Before he could finish, a loud metallic bang echoed through the shelter. The walls vibrated, and John's heart leaped into his throat. Something had made contact with the outer hatch. Lyra's eyes widened, and she began speaking rapidly, her voice tinged with panic. John didn't need to understand the words to know what she was saying. They had run out of time. Pursuers in the dark. The metallic thud reverberated through the small shelter like a warning bell. John's instincts screamed at him to grab a weapon. Anything, but the tools scattered around his workbench were meant for research, not survival. He glanced at Lyra, who had frozen in place, her glowing patterns dimming to a dull flicker. She looked terrified, yet there was a spark of determination in her eyes. The console beeped again, louder and faster. The external sensors now displayed multiple moving objects surrounding the shelter. Whatever was outside wasn't hiding anymore. "Friends of yours?" John asked, his voice dripping with unease. Lyra turned to him sharply, shaking her head. She pointed to her scanner, then to the dots on the screen, and drew a sharp line across her throat. The message was clear. Those outside were not here to talk. The shelter's lights flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Another thud, this time closer, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal being scraped. John's throat tightened. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, they were testing the hatch, probing for weakness. Lyra moved quickly, though her body still trembled from exhaustion. She adjusted the strange device in her hands, and a faint holographic interface appeared. Her glowing patterns pulsed faintly in time with the device, as if they were somehow linked. John watched as she pressed several buttons, and the room seemed to hum with new energy. "What are you doing?" John asked, stepping closer. She pointed at the walls, then at him, speaking urgently in her alien tongue. Though her words were incomprehensible, her gestures told the story. She was reinforcing the shelter's defenses. A faint, shimmering field appeared over the walls, barely visible but undeniably there. It looked like a shield, but Lyra's expression told him it wouldn't last long. "That's impressive," John muttered, though his voice was strained. "But I don't think they're just going to give up." As if to prove him right, a sharp, piercing noise filled the air, a sound like glass being shattered by a high-frequency drill. John clapped his hands over his ears, wincing as the noise rattled through his skull. Lyra staggered but held her ground, her glowing patterns flaring brightly in defiance. "They're trying to force their way in," John realized, shouting over the noise. "How much time do we have?" Lyra didn't answer, but the look in her eyes said it all. Not much. The console beeped again, displaying a new alert. One of the dots on the screen had stopped moving, hovering just outside the shelter. A moment later, the banging on the hatch stopped, replaced by a deep mechanical hum. John's gut twisted. "They're not leaving, are they?" Lyra shook her head, her expression grim. She grabbed his arm and gestured toward a small compartment on the far wall. John frowned, then realized what she wanted: the emergency survival gear. "You want to run?" he asked, incredulous. "In this storm, they'll tear us apart out there." Lyra's grip tightened, her glowing patterns flickering brighter. Her message was clear. Staying wasn't an option. Whatever those things were, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. John hesitated, his mind racing. The storm outside was brutal, but it might be their only chance. He nodded reluctantly and grabbed the survival packs, slinging one over his shoulder. Lyra adjusted the device in her hands, and the shimmering field around the walls began to pulse irregularly. It was failing. "All right," John said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We go out the back. There's a rover in the storage bay. It's not much, but it'll get us away from here." Lyra nodded, her glowing patterns steadying. Together, they moved toward the storage bay, their footsteps quick and silent. The faint hum of the intruders outside grew louder, punctuated by the occasional sharp bang on the walls. The air felt heavy, charged with tension. They reached the bay just as the shelter's power flickered again. John punched in the access code, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. The rover sat in the center of the room, its surface dusted with frost. It was built for rugged terrain but wasn't designed for escape missions. "Get in," John said, climbing into the driver's seat. Lyra followed, clutching her device tightly as she settled into the passenger side. Her glowing patterns pulsed with nervous energy, casting faint light on the dashboard. As John started the rover, the shelter's lights flickered one last time before plunging into darkness. The shield had failed. A loud crash echoed through the base, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. The intruders were inside. "Hold on," John said, gripping the controls tightly. The rover roared to life, its engines cutting through the silence. He slammed the accelerator, and the vehicle shot forward, bursting through the back exit into the storm. Snow whipped against the windshield, and the blizzard swallowed them whole. But even through the storm, John could see faint lights behind them, growing brighter with every passing second. "They're following us," he muttered, his knuckles white on the controls. Lyra pointed ahead, shouting something in her language. John didn't understand the words, but her urgency was clear. They needed to move faster. The chase had begun, and John knew one thing for certain. Whatever Lyra was running from, it wasn't just dangerous. It was relentless. A shared escape plan. The rover jolted violently as it hit a patch of uneven ice, throwing John against the controls. He gritted his teeth, tightening his grip on the wheel as the wind howled outside, slamming against the vehicle like an angry beast. Beside him, Lyra clung to the seat, her glowing patterns dim and erratic, a stark contrast to the storm raging around them. Behind them, faint lights pierced through the swirling snow. Their pursuers were relentless, hovering just out of reach, but inching closer with every passing second. The low hum of their engines carried ominously through the storm, a constant reminder that escape wasn't guaranteed. John glanced at Lyra. "We can't outrun them forever," he said, though he knew she didn't understand his words. Still, she met his gaze, her expression resolute. She didn't need to understand the specifics. She already knew the stakes. Lyra shifted in her seat, pulling out the damaged device she had been clutching since they fled the shelter. She fiddled with its glowing controls, her fingers trembling as if the effort was costing her more than just energy. The device emitted a faint hum before projecting a new hologram. It wasn't a map this time. It was a schematic of what looked like a massive cavern. "What's this?" John asked, narrowing his eyes at the image. It showed a network of tunnels, one of which seemed to lead into an enormous underground chamber. Lyra pointed to the hologram, then gestured at the horizon ahead. Her glowing patterns flared momentarily, a spark of hope cutting through the tension. She said something in her language, her voice firm despite the urgency in her tone. John squinted at the projection. "A safe place," he guessed, piecing together her intent. "You think we can lose them in there?" She nodded emphatically, her glowing patterns brightening. The map pulsed once, highlighting a specific path through the tunnels. John swallowed hard, glancing at the faint lights behind them. The distance between them and their pursuers was shrinking. "All right," he muttered, turning the rover sharply toward the marked path. "Let's hope you know what you're doing." The terrain grew rougher as they neared the entrance to the tunnels. Ice gave way to jagged rock, and the rover's wheels struggled for traction. John pushed the vehicle harder, the engine growling in protest. The lights behind them flickered closer, their pursuers closing in like wolves on prey. Suddenly, the hologram emitted a sharp beep. Lyra pointed ahead, her glowing patterns flaring brightly as she shouted something. John followed her gesture and spotted a narrow crevice barely visible through the storm. It was the entrance to the tunnels. "That's it," John said, his voice rising with disbelief. "It's tiny." Lyra nodded urgently, motioning for him to keep going. John clenched his jaw and steered the rover toward the crevice. The vehicle barely fit, its sides scraping against the rocky walls as they squeezed through. Behind them, the hum of the pursuer's engines grew louder, echoing ominously off the narrow canyon walls. The rover burst into the tunnel, its headlights casting long shadows on the damp stone walls. The sound of the storm faded slightly, replaced by the steady rumble of the vehicle and the distant hum of their hunters. John didn't dare slow down, even as the path twisted and turned, threatening to tip the rover with each sharp curve. "Now what?" he asked, glancing at Lyra. She studied the hologram intently, her glowing pattern steadying as she directed him with gestures. Left, right, straight. Each turn felt like a gamble, but the map seemed to guide them deeper into the maze of tunnels. Behind them, the hum of the pursuers grew fainter, muffled by the twisting stone walls. For the first time, John felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they could lose them after all. Just as the thought crossed his mind, the rover jolted to a sudden stop. John slammed forward against the controls, cursing as he realized the front wheels were stuck. He jumped out into the freezing air, his boots crunching on the rocky ground. The rover's wheels had sunk into a patch of soft, unstable ground, a hidden trap in the darkness. "Great," John muttered, kicking at the wheel. Perfect timing. Lyra climbed out after him, her glowing patterns flickering uneasily as she studied their predicament. She pointed to the hologram again, then at the path ahead. The cavern wasn't far. If they could get the rover free, they might still make it. John grabbed a tool from the back of the rover and began working to free the wheels, his breath fogging in the cold air. Lyra knelt beside him, using her device to scan the ground. The hologram flickered, revealing another dot, one that wasn't on their side. Their pursuers had entered the tunnels. "Of course," John muttered, glancing at the dark path behind them. The hum of engines was faint but growing louder. Time was running out. Lyra touched his shoulder, her glowing patterns brighter now. She gestured for him to follow her, pointing toward the cavern on the hologram. She spoke again, her tone firm and unyielding. "You want to go on foot?" John asked, his voice laced with disbelief. He looked at the stuck rover, then back at the hologram. The cavern was close, maybe close enough to reach before their hunters caught up. He exhaled sharply, tossing the tool back into the rover. "All right," he said, grabbing the survival pack. "Lead the way." Lyra nodded, her glowing pattern steadying as she turned toward the path ahead. Together, they plunged deeper into the tunnels, the hum of their pursuers growing louder behind them. The real chase had begun. A chase through the blizzard. The sound of engines roared behind them, amplified by the cavern's twisting walls. John's legs burned as he sprinted through the dark tunnels, his breath fogging in the icy air. Lyra ran just ahead, her glowing patterns lighting the jagged path like faint stars. The holographic map in her hand pulsed erratically, the device struggling to maintain its signal in the harsh environment. "They're catching up," John shouted, his voice echoing off the stone. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw flickering lights weaving through the darkness, a relentless pack of alien craft that moved with eerie precision. Lyra didn't respond. She glanced at the map, then at a fork in the tunnel ahead. She pointed to the left, urging him forward. John didn't hesitate, veering into the narrower passage as the roar of the engines grew deafening. The walls closed in around them, forcing John to duck as jagged rocks jutted from above. The sound of the pursuers was muffled slightly, but it was clear they wouldn't stop. John's mind raced as he pushed himself to keep up with Lyra's pace. Who were these hunters, and why were they so determined to catch her? "Got any bright ideas?" John panted as they emerged into a larger cavern. It was vast, with a ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. Frozen stalactites glinted faintly in the dim light of Lyra's patterns. The air felt heavier here, as if the cavern itself were alive, holding its breath. Lyra turned to him, her glowing patterns flickering in what looked like hesitation. She pointed to a ledge above them, gesturing for him to climb. John followed her gaze, his stomach sinking. The ledge was steep and covered in frost, its surface slick and treacherous. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, but the sound of the engine spurred him into action. Gripping the icy rock with numb fingers, he began the climb. Lyra followed closely, her small frame moving with surprising agility. They reached the ledge just as the first of the alien craft burst into the cavern below. The machines were sleek and angular, their metallic surfaces glowing faintly in the dark. They hovered like predatory birds, scanning the area with beams of pale light. John pressed himself flat against the rock, his breath shallow. Beside him, Lyra held her glowing device tightly, her expression a mix of fear and determination. She gestured for him to stay quiet, her glowing patterns dimming as if to make herself less noticeable. The craft moved slowly, their searchlights sweeping the cavern floor. John's heart pounded in his chest as one of the beams passed dangerously close to their hiding spot. He clenched his fists, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. If they were caught, he doubted these things would ask questions before acting. Lyra suddenly reached for her device, her movements slow and deliberate. She pressed a series of buttons, and the map on the hologram shifted to display a new feature, a pulsing red dot near the edge of the cavern. "What's that?" John whispered, leaning closer. Lyra pointed to the dot. Then at the far end of the cavern, she mimed an explosion with her hands, her glowing patterns flaring briefly. John's eyes widened as he realized what she was planning. "You want to collapse the cavern?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. "While we're still in it." Lyra nodded, her expression grim but resolute. She motioned for him to follow, then began to move along the ledge toward the red dot's location. John hesitated for a split second, then followed her. The alternative was getting caught, and whatever that meant, he wasn't keen to find out. The ledge grew narrower as they edged along, the sound of the alien craft echoing below them. One of the machines hovered closer, its searchlight sweeping the rocks just a few feet beneath their position. John held his breath, pressing himself against the wall as tightly as he could. His pulse thundered in his ears. Lyra reached the edge of the ledge first, crouching beside a jagged outcrop. She placed her device against the rock and began pressing buttons. The hologram flared briefly, then dimmed. A faint vibration rippled through the air, and a low hum began to build, emanating from deep within the rock. John felt the ground beneath him tremble. "This better work," he muttered, inching closer to Lyra. The alien craft seemed to sense the shift. Their movements grew more frantic, their searchlights darting across the cavern as if they were trying to locate the source of the disturbance. One of the machines let out a piercing screech, a sound that sent shivers down John's spine. Lyra grabbed John's arm and pointed toward a narrow opening on the far side of the cavern. It was barely visible, hidden in shadow, but it was their only way out. She gestured urgently, and John didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted toward the opening, the tremors growing stronger with every step. Behind them, the alien craft began to scatter, their movements chaotic as the cavern structure started to give way. Cracks spread across the frozen stalactites above, sending shards of ice crashing to the ground. John and Lyra dove through the narrow passage just as a deafening roar filled the air. The cavern collapsed behind them, sealing the alien craft inside. The ground shook violently, and a rush of freezing air blasted through the tunnel, knocking them both to the ground. For a moment, there was only silence. Then John coughed, pulling himself to his knees. Lyra was already sitting up, her glowing patterns flickering weakly but steadily. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, then offered a small, tired smile. "We're alive," John muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "Barely, but alive." Lyra's smile widened slightly, and for the first time, John thought he saw a flicker of hope in her glowing eyes. The final stand. The air inside the cavern was heavy and still, the silence broken only by the faint hum of Lyra's device and John's labored breathing. Dust from the recent collapse still lingered in the air, catching the faint glow of Lyra's patterns as she adjusted the hologram. John leaned against the cold stone wall, his hands trembling, not just from the cold, but from the weight of what had just happened. "They're not gone, are they?" John asked, though he already knew the answer. Lyra glanced at him, her glowing eyes dim with exhaustion. She shook her head and pointed to the hologram. A new set of dots appeared, farther away, but moving steadily toward them. The collapse had bought them time, but it hadn't stopped the pursuers. "Great," John muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "So now what?" Lyra hesitated, her glowing patterns flickering as if mirroring her thoughts. Then she knelt on the rocky floor, spreading the hologram to reveal a larger map of the area. She pointed to a glowing blue marker, a massive underground chamber not far from their current location. She spoke a single word, her voice steady despite her weariness. "Sanctuary." John frowned. "Sanctuary? What kind of sanctuary?" Lyra didn't answer directly. Instead, she pressed a sequence of buttons on her device, and the hologram shifted again, displaying what looked like an ancient structure buried within the chamber. Its design was alien but symmetrical, with spiraling towers and glowing conduits radiating out like veins. The image pulsed faintly, as if the structure itself were alive. "You think that place can stop them?" John asked, skeptical but intrigued. Lyra nodded firmly, her glowing patterns brightening in resolve. She pointed to the path ahead, urging him to move. John exhaled sharply, pushing himself off the wall. His body ached, and every instinct told him to rest, but the determination in Lyra's eyes left him no choice. "All right," he said, grabbing his pack. "Let's find your sanctuary." The journey to the chamber was grueling. The tunnels twisted and narrowed, forcing them to crawl through tight spaces and climb over jagged rocks. The temperature dropped with each step, and the air grew thinner, making every breath a struggle. Yet Lyra pressed on, her resolve unshaken. Finally, they reached the edge of the chamber. John froze as the vast space unfolded before them, his breath catching in his throat. The sanctuary was massive, its towering spires reaching up to the cavern's ceiling like frozen lightning bolts. Strange symbols glowed faintly along the walls, pulsing in time with the faint hum that filled the air. The entire structure radiated a sense of power, ancient and unyielding. "This is it," John whispered, awestruck. Lyra nodded, stepping forward with a mix of urgency and reverence. She placed her glowing device against a large circular panel near the base of the nearest tower. The panel flared to life, and the ground beneath them rumbled as the sanctuary awakened. Lights flickered along the walls, and the hum grew louder, resonating through the chamber like a heartbeat. But the moment of wonder was short-lived. A sharp mechanical screech echoed through the tunnels behind them. John turned, his stomach twisting as the sound of engines grew louder once more. The pursuers had found them. "Lyra, whatever you're doing, do it faster," John shouted, grabbing a jagged piece of rock as an improvised weapon. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Lyra's glowing patterns flared brightly as she worked, her fingers flying over the controls. The sanctuary responded, its lights intensifying as ancient mechanisms stirred to life. A low rumble filled the chamber, and John realized the structure was more than just a building. It was a weapon. The first of the alien craft burst into the chamber, its sleek form gliding through the air like a predator. John threw himself behind a rock as a beam of light scorched the ground where he had been standing. The heat singed his face, and his heart pounded in his chest. "Lyra," he shouted, his voice hoarse. She didn't look up, but the sanctuary responded. A pulse of energy rippled through the chamber, and the air seemed to thrum with power. One of the towers fired a beam of light, striking the pursuing craft and sending it crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks. John stared in disbelief. "Now we're talking." More craft poured into the chamber, their movements frantic as they dodged the sanctuary's defenses. John scrambled to Lyra's side, shielding her as best he could while she worked. The sanctuary continued to fire, its ancient systems proving more powerful than John had imagined. But it wasn't enough. The alien craft were adapting, their movements becoming faster and more coordinated. "Can't this thing do more?" John asked, his voice rising with desperation. Lyra looked at him, her glowing patterns flickering erratically. She pointed to the central tower, where a large, circular platform pulsed with blue light. Her meaning was clear. The sanctuary's full power could only be activated manually. "You want me to go up there?" John asked, glancing at the tower as more beams of light streaked past them. "That's suicide." Lyra placed a hand on his arm, her glowing eyes locking onto his. She didn't speak, but her expression said it all. She trusted him. John swallowed hard, gripping the jagged rock in his hand. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Let's finish this." With a final nod to Lyra, he sprinted toward the tower, dodging debris and enemy fire. The sanctuary pulsed around him, its ancient mechanisms roaring to life as he climbed the steps toward the platform. The air crackled with energy, and John could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Reaching the platform, he placed his hands on the glowing panel at its center. The sanctuary responded instantly, its lights flaring so brightly that the entire chamber was bathed in blinding white. The ground trembled, and a deafening roar filled the air as the sanctuary unleashed its full power. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, John felt like they had a chance. The turning point. The chamber was a storm of light and sound, the sanctuary's ancient power thrumming through every stone and spire. John clung to the central platform, his hands pressed against the glowing panel as energy surged beneath him. The air crackled, and a blinding pulse erupted from the sanctuary's core, spreading outward like a tidal wave. The alien craft in the chamber faltered midair. Their sleek forms shuddered violently as the pulse collided with them, disrupting their systems. One by one, they dropped to the ground with deafening crashes, their lights flickering out like dying embers. John stumbled back from the panel, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. The sanctuary's energy still pulsed faintly around him, but the immediate threat seemed to be over. For the first time, the air was still. "Lyra," he shouted, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. His legs felt like jelly, but he forced himself to move, scrambling down the steps toward her. He found her near the base of the tower, slumped against the stone. Her glowing patterns were dim, barely visible, and her breaths came shallow and uneven. She clutched the damaged device in her hand, its hologram flickering weakly. "Hey," John said, dropping to his knees beside her. "Stay with me, okay? You can't give up now." Lyra's eyes fluttered open, and she managed a faint smile. She spoke softly in her language, her voice barely above a whisper. John didn't understand the words, but he felt the meaning. Gratitude. "You're welcome," he said, forcing a smile of his own. "But we're not done yet. That was just the first wave, wasn't it?" Lyra nodded weakly, confirming his worst fear. The pulse had bought them time, but it hadn't eliminated the threat entirely. The sanctuary had done its job, but its power was limited. Their enemies would regroup, and they wouldn't make the same mistakes twice. John looked at her device, the hologram now showing the cavern's surroundings. A new set of dots was already approaching, larger and more numerous than before. His stomach twisted. They had minutes, maybe less, before the next assault. "We can't stay here," he said, his mind racing. "But if they're sending everything after us, that means you're important. That thing you're carrying, it's the key, isn't it?" Lyra nodded again, her glowing patterns flickering faintly as she held up the device. Her expression turned solemn, and she pointed to him, then to the sanctuary's central platform. She spoke a single word: "Protect." John stared at her, his chest tightening. "You want me to stay here and protect the sanctuary? What about you?" She shook her head, pointing to the tunnels leading out of the chamber. Her glowing patterns flared briefly as she placed the device in his hands. She was passing it to him. "No," John said, his voice cracking. "I'm not leaving you here." Lyra touched his arm gently, her glowing eyes meeting his. There was a strange peace in her expression, a quiet acceptance. She spoke again, her voice steady despite the weakness in her body. John didn't understand the words, but he understood the message. Her mission was to protect the device, and now that mission was his. The sound of engines echoed through the tunnels, growing louder by the second. The enemy was closing in. "Damn it," John muttered, his grip tightening on the device. "You're really not giving me a choice, are you?" Lyra managed another faint smile, her glowing patterns flickering one last time before dimming completely. John's chest tightened as he realized she had passed out, her body too weak to continue. The engines roared louder, and the chamber trembled as the first wave of reinforcements arrived. John looked down at the device in his hands, its glowing symbols casting faint light on his face. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a key. It was a beacon, a weapon, and a lifeline all in one. He stood, his resolve hardening. "All right, Lyra," he said, his voice steady. "You trusted me with this, so I'll see it through." John hoisted her over his shoulder, careful not to jostle her too much, and began making his way toward the tunnels. The sanctuary's defenses hummed to life again, firing at the advancing forces. He didn't look back. There was no time to dwell on what was left behind. As he entered the narrow passage, the sounds of the battle grew fainter. The device in his hands pulsed rhythmically, as if guiding him forward. For the first time, he didn't feel like a bystander in someone else's story. He was part of something bigger now, something worth fighting for. The tunnel ahead opened into the cold, endless expanse of the planet's surface. The storm had subsided, leaving the landscape eerily still. John set Lyra down gently, wrapping her in the thermal jacket to keep her warm. He glanced back at the tunnel, then at the horizon, where faint lights in the sky hinted at more ships arriving. "All right," he muttered, gripping the device tightly. "Let's see if humanity can live up to the hype." With Lyra by his side and the alien device in his hands, John took his first steps into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next.